Hi, I'm Sylve, co-founder of Hyli, the lean blockchain for provable applications. This is part 2 of the Hylé Podcast, where we interview David Amor about Playmint. If you haven't watched part 1, I recommend you start by doing that, as we're going to dive right into where we start at the last episode. Cheers!
One of the things that we found missing in the EVM ecosystem was a tick. This is something that you build games around, and in traditional games, and the absence of a tick caused a lot of headaches in game design and how we built downstream. We had to use a bunch of hacks in order to solve something that it's just considered part of the system in the traditional game. And when looking at Playerchains, we were able to reintroduce a tick that goes at a steady rate. So every 100 milliseconds, then the game moves on, or that's something that can be set for the game that we built. Substream, that moves on at 100 milliseconds, but being able to build a game around that and then compensate for it, as you say, do a rollback if you haven't heard from some of the other players. But now we're decentralized, but we're back more in traditional gaming architecture. It becomes easier to make a more traditional style of game that's more fluid, as you say, and has more presence. I would say that we deliberately built a game that really tested how fast we could get that to go, and can we create the most extreme kind of test for netcode. And in games generally, the world has limited by the speed of light, so there's always going to be some amount of time between hearing from people, particularly if they're a long distance away. So you always in games find ways of compensating for that. But yeah, we were able to build an infrastructure that allowed us to solve those problems in the same way as we would in traditional games. Yeah, that was something that we built. And in a sense, it ends up being a new type of layer one. I don't want to get too caught in hyperbole, but it's a different way. It's a different type of blockchain. So blockchains work in layer ones work in a certain way that we've got used to, and that's what we built downstream on, but it's not the best architecture for building games. And what we've built is as decentralized as a blockchain, but is architected in a very different way that we think is more suitable for building games.
A nice feature of the system that you've built is that you're still, I would say, composable or amenable to interacting with the rest of the blockchain ecosystem, where a particular substream game is like a shard that can be rolled back into the on-chain bits, where it's like you get to have your cake and eat it too. The assets maybe live on the base layer that gives you like hard ordering and sequencing, where you actually know where things are, where you really need to make sure that like my gold coins are exactly in that balance. But you can still shard out like the state channel in Bitcoin world, where okay, there's going to be a battle here, and then we roll back the result of the battle, and my balance goes to 0 and your balance goes up to 5.
Yeah.
But you didn't have to send all the inputs on the blockchain. It just has to be resolved on the blockchain, a bit like in a way, a settlement layer or clearinghouse in traditional finance sense.
Yes. Yeah, I think we'd agree that blockchains are great for some things, but not everything. So let's find the correct technology for the task at hand. I sometimes think of that global state. Imagine that we built a game that involves flying down to a planet and then building things Minecraft style on those planets and then zooming off to another planet. Well, the universe doesn't need to know about every single thing that we're doing on that planet until you come and visit. If somebody new comes and visits, then great, you can be part of this world. And then when we all leave, then probably that world state needs to be saved somewhere. But I don't think you don't need to update the universe on every single block that you change. And you just have to update people when it becomes necessary to know it. My analogy is that I don't care what's happening in Paris until I go and visit. I do a little bit, so I shouldn't pick on Paris. But like I love Paris, and it's a beautiful city. it only becomes relevant to me when I go there and I need to know how the metro works and what are the good restaurants. Like today, as I sit here in Brighton in the UK, that's not very relevant to me, but it becomes very relevant when I go there. So similarly, I think we can organize ourselves in a player chain format and then update people as and when they need to know about it. And maybe we'd use the blockchain for that, or maybe there's other systems for doing that.
There may be a bit of idealism in the way we've tried to tackle these problems, where I'm starting to use the term big blockchain as like the lobby, where, okay, everything must fit on chain, or
Yes.
it's just unfit for use and it's uncalled for, and it's beyond the pale that we would dare give players anything but best decentralized experience on chain. Result is that they just really don't care, it seems. So I'm much more interested in these approaches that are more like alloys in a way.
Yes.
You put 99% of a certain metal that may be a little bit less highbrow, but just 1% of gold or platinum, and you just create something that is sturdier than 100% gold or 100% lead.
Yes.
And I like this approach of just use the right tool for the job, and I think it just makes a ton of sense. And in a way, if you look at the history even of games, it's just full of tricks, full of smokes and mirrors. Even in multiplayer in Doom, these guys were using phone lines. They were using all kinds of tricks. Like they knew that the player would go forward like by that distance.
Yeah.
So you only need to pull like up to the refresh rate, because you just know that if you receive like forward, that's where the player is going to end up. So you don't need to blow up the bandwidth. And it's just full of these tricks. And I think we've been maybe a bit idealistic in saying that we don't need tricks here. The tech is good enough. But
and I guess another issue. So I do care about decentralization. That's what brought me to the space. Not really crypto, not really speculation, but like decentralization. And in order to get that kind of speed in fully on-chain games, we've ended up being more and more centralized. So we're guilty of this as a company, that Downstream at one point really ran on a server. Okay, on that server was a blockchain, but it ends up feeling a little centralized. Like we're paying the bill for this, and it runs on an Azure server. So in our efforts to become more performant and being a fully on-chain game, then we've started to introduce centralization. And I can make the argument that we settle on another layer or something like that. But given that we're already using tricks and hacks in order to get the performance where we want it in fully on-chain games, then for me, Playerchains is, okay, a different approach that actually ends up being more decentralized than being a fully on-chain game, because we're starting to introduce centralization in order to get the performance where we want it. So it's just a different line of thinking.
You folks went through the ringer, because in 2021 you were using circuits, then you used Cairo, then you were some of the first users of mods, you launched on Redstone, and now you're moving on your own tech stack and something completely different. And that must not be very easy, and B, that must not be easy to explain also to just members of the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, a lot of problems to solve. We have some talented people that know how to build those kind of things. And yeah, our experience was building directly on Ethereum. That was challenging because Ethereum is slow and expensive. That was what our first game was built on. And in fact, we never built on Mud. So Mud is a great framework for building fully on-chain games. It arrived after we were some way into our game, so it's not something that we've used. And we did try Starknet, which I think is certainly a promising, or maybe the first example of a layer 2. I talked earlier about needing to solve some performance issues, and layer 2 seemed like a good way of doing that. Starknet seemed like a good choice, but in doing so, we had to embrace Cairo 0, which was a challenging development environment if you're trying to build a video game, let's say.
This is a fantastic euphemism. I'm glad you came up with it.
Challenging, yeah. And then, to try and get that kind of performance, we ended up building proof circuits and verifying them on chain. So really, you talk about hacks, but wow, some heavy maths going on in order to just play a video game. But I think that pushing off in a different direction leads to interesting results. And I think probably I would say that Our experience with building circuits and the idea of state channels and verifying on chain, all of those things pushes us toward, gives us maybe some courage to say, hang on a minute, should we approach this in a completely different way by making every player. We're just in that world already, which I think leads us to some slightly more radical approaches, which is where we got to Playerchains. So maybe I can paint a path that by building in challenging environments forces us to come up with some new ideas.
What's something that you're excited about with Playerchains?
I think we've lost our way in, let's say, Web3 games, maybe even Web3. Like the promise of Web3 for me was disintermediation. Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. We've ended up in a situation where so much of the power and value of the internet has ended up in the hands of Apple and Google and Facebook, etc., Twitter. And it's avoidable. Like it shouldn't be that way. And there's a set of, you can address these issues with decentralization ideas. And it's a disappointment to me that Web3 gaming and maybe Web3 more generally has ended up being about crypto speculation. And so why I'm excited about Playerchains is it's a solution for a real problem. Like how do you introduce decentralization to traditional video games, not games about speculation, games that, and more generally, to pull out, then there's probably some version of a metaverse ahead of us. And I know that metaverse is a bit of a four-letter word, but it's in the widest possible sense. And a place that we can exist digitally, and I don't know if that's, you call that a 3D internet or a set of experiences that are a bit more game-like. But I don't want those to be just siloed experiences. I want them to be more open. I think that the internet is the amazing place that it is because it's built on open standards and you can build what you want permissionlessly. That's not true of games. If I want to put a game on the Google Play Store, I have to ask for Google's permission, submit it to them, and ask if I can use Google's monetization method, and I can only build what they allow me to build. And that isn't the case with the web. It's just things built on open standards. But in gaming, it's super centralized, and I think it's really holding the games industry back and certainly holding metaverse back. A long answer to a short question, but I think the correct path, Playerchains is one step along the right path to decentralization, and I think that a lot of crypto has got distracted by trying to make money on Bitcoin or whatever, and that's fine, but that's not why I'm here, and Playerchains represents the start of a better approach, I think, for decentralizing games.
Preach.
Like specifically, like if you think about a web browser, which is a centralized bit of technology, it works very well. And by the way, we have a choice, right? We can use Firefox, we can use Chrome, we can use Internet Explorer, whatever we want. And so there's that choice of centralized browser, but it looks in on a set of decentralized content. DNS, HTTP, HTML, SSL, TSL, all of these open standards allow wonderful things to be built. And those companies, by the way, like Chrome, can still monetize their browser if they want to. So it's perfectly possible to create successful businesses on decentralized standards. But if I compare that with the Google Play Store, everything inside it is centrally controlled. And okay, the world keeps turning, but I want a better world where I think you get a much better result if games were more open. And I think by opening up games, you probably lead you to some future version of the internet.
It all boils down to this idea of, let's say, a data monopoly, where the pipes themselves of the internet work quite well. Like
yes.
TCP, IP, everything else. The pipes work well, but everything on the, I would say, the data storage or the execution or changing these bits of data, like we still haven't found a good way to manage that, basically. It still has to be on someone's server. And so we invented another type of Sylve, which is called the blockchain. And so we either have a big Microsoft or big blockchain, and it's just either or. And as you said, the pipes themselves are neutral and allow for emergence of other like competition, or like email clients may not be exactly true now with Gmail, but theoretically,
Yes.
that could work. But the application side is still it's still not neutral. You cannot beat network effects. You cannot beat distribution. And I think that's something that really excites me about Playerchain. It honestly, I think it boils down to distribution. It's just so instant to spin up an instance like on one computer, and then you can set up anything you want on top of it, like betting, or if you want like a fully centralized thing, or you can create a guild or something else, and that lives with the people who actually have a vested interest in making sure this world survives, which are players themselves. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think that there are a set of technologies that Playerchains maybe is a way of approaching serverless multiplayer. But we're thinking about, what does decentralized sign-in look like? What does decentralized in-app purchase look like? What does decentralized distribution and ad networks? And we all the pipe work that sits above the very low-level internet pipe work is centrally controlled right now, but not necessarily. And I think that's holding things back. And I'd like to offer up to the games industry, look, here's a different way of approaching this that has better long-term effects. And I think that the winning strategy, actually, if you're Epic or Minecraft or Roblox or a bunch of other things, is to embrace a more open strategy. And it's interesting that you will see the more enlightened leaders, I think including Zirk and certainly including Tim Sweeney, they recognize that a decentralized approach is the correct approach. Someone told me the story of how you remember that Microsoft kept Internet Explorer very much the dominant browser, and Bill Gates fought for years to keep it as a dominant browser on any Windows platform. And eventually the government said, look, this is competitive. He admitted that it absolutely was the right thing to do for the world, to open it up. He kept it in his business interest to just make that the dominant browser, but the world ends up better with a choice of browsers and a choice of how you engage with the internet. And today we find ourselves in games or interactive experiences being in very centralized ones, but I think the world becomes better when they're decentralized.
We are both part of I would say, a think tank or a group of people working around the concept of trust infrastructure,
Yep.
which in my definition is using decentralized technologies to the best of their abilities when they make sense, whether they're peer-to-peer networks, CRDTs, cryptography, or blockchain themselves. So it's a very ragtag group of people centered around Arno Schenk, who wrote the seminal trust infrastructure blog post. What brought you to that group of people?
I like the fact that there's a set of people that are thinking about trust in a different way. So we have blockchains that have a level of trust that are built around 10,000 nodes agreeing that this fact is true. And that's useful for some things, but not everything. So the level of trust that's necessary in a typical video game is not the same level of trust that's necessary in securing a $1 million transaction from one person to another. And that level of trust that is present on public blockchains is heavy-handed for games and comes at a cost. Comes at a cost of gas fees, comes at a cost of slow transactions. And so I think that you have to find a different way of approaching trust. And if you want to fix that, like Playerchains is an example of okay, it works well once there's a certain degree of trust, but how do you establish that initial trust? And the trust infrastructure group looks at things like attestations, like you can prove that I'm this person, or I've done this in the past, or I'm a trustworthy person for this, that, and the other. Moving away from the trust that you see in a public blockchain, you need to find a different approach for trusting players. And I think that group of people that are thinking about trust in a different way, that I think is suitable for how you might approach trust in decentralized video games. But in truth, that's a fresh area for me. I think you understand that ecosystem better than I do. I just recognize that we need to solve the problem in a different way. And in that group of people, I see them trying to solve that problem or offer up different solutions than just using a public blockchain. So that's why it's a group that I find interesting to talk to.
One thing that really resonates with me is this idea of rethinking trust. And Bitcoin was built out of a failure of trust, basically. It came out of the 2008 crisis where the trust me bro approach that we had failed massively. And it's like the pendulum swung back at full force in the opposite direction. And the Bitcoin white paper tells you very clearly that you will never have to trust anyone ever again.
Yes.
It is impossible for anyone to get the coins. It is telling that it was published on the Sylve mailing list, which is a group of researchers and enthusiasts around this idea of correcting the asymmetry between a centralized power like a government and the individual. And absolutely, I don't think people quite realize the impact that cryptography has had on everything. It is insane to think that it is now possible to write something and send it to someone and no one else can read it. Cryptos means hidden, and graphene means writing, like hiding things in scriptures. It works. And this is an asymmetry that is ridiculously powerful, which led to some very radical type of thinking where, and I think blockchain is the culmination of this idea of you should never trust anyone. There's this idea of don't trust, verify, and it can take you to, I would say, some very radical places, such as, oh, we don't need government anymore, we don't need people anymore, we just need to code a smart contract really well, and that's all good. And one thinking that I really love is Hyli, the blogger. They wrote a fantastic blog post called More Like Dumb Contracts, where they said, no, the good thing about contract is that they're subjective. That's the really good thing. And if it ends up that the nature of the contract, that the object of the contract is moot, like you shouldn't even have a contract, and it's idealistic and it's very dumb to think that you should always enforce things like to a T. And I think it's this idea of asymmetry. Like you want to make sure that there's something like measurable, objective that you can oppose to a stronger subjective force. But what we've lost along the way is this ability to just create something between fully trusting an entity and absolutely not trusting it. And there's a massive range of expression in between that makes sense. And that is very easily negotiated in the physical sense.
Yes.
Where you're in a room with someone, like you know where the boundaries are and you know what you trust and what you reveal. There's always a sense of not revealing absolutely everything. But blockchains are panopticon, where everything is clear, or on the opposite side where you just forfeit everything. But we just never managed to translate that into the digital world. And I think that's what really interesting in trust infrastructure. And I see Playerchains as a really good showcase of this, because you don't have the same, let's say, trust assumptions between where you are at the stack. Maybe there's a very high stakes game between players, and so they're very careful about what's going to happen. And like they put money down, and then the game is recorded and analyzed, and before everything is settled.
Yes.
If we're just playing something for funsies, you don't have the same requirements. The trust assumptions are not the same. And if someone cheats, it's like Monopoly, whatever.
Yeah, I too found Arnaud's blog piece, thought-provoking. I think I'm going to do a bad job of paraphrasing it, but you can say you don't need to trust me because here's infrastructure that demonstrates why you don't need to trust me at all, and that's sort of what public blockchains are. Or you can take a different approach, which is here's reasons to trust me, or here's a set of things about me that indicate that I'm trustworthy enough to do what we're about to do. And the latter is much more in tune with our society. That's how we go about our lives. Like I don't need a level. If I go and buy a sandwich at lunchtime, I'm going to make up an example on the fly here. Like I don't need I have a level of trust that he's not going to put poison in my sandwich. Like I'm not necessarily going to I'm not going to buy a house from him without a contract in place, but I'm happy to buy a sandwich, and there's a level of trust because he's here in our town and people go there. That's how society works. We find an appropriate level of trust to do the thing we're about to do. And I think that trying to do everything with trustless is problematic and unnecessary. If, as you say, if I'm playing a game with my buddies, then we just need the majority of us to, in my opinion, then we just need the majority of us to agree what happened. And sure, if there's a bad actor, then we need to know about the bad actor and kick him out so we don't play them in the next game. So maybe some mechanism of showing that. But we don't need the same level of trust as moving $1 million between players. And so I think what I see in the trust infrastructure group is teams that are looking to find some shades of grey between trust me completely and you don't need to trust me at all, and a set of mechanisms to get different degrees of trust, whether it's attestations or some other another set of systems. And yeah, Playerchains, I suppose, it has a level of trust that works. You have to have a super consensus, i.e. 2/3 of the players in that need to agree what's happened. And so there is a scenario where a bunch of strangers join the game and get the consensus and then break it in some way, and you don't have agreement on what happened. So you can solve that by saying, okay, we need a trustless environment. Or you can say, should we just be a bit more careful to make sure that we don't have a bunch of people joining our group? In which case, the question is, how do we establish that they're untrustworthy? We do this every day with WhatsApp. There's a degree of trust to add somebody to a WhatsApp group. We found a mechanism of doing that. We know them in real life, or there's some other KPI that we use to establish whether we're happy for them to be in our group. Like it's not trustlessness, but it works in our society. A set of tools that allow us to create a level of trust that we're happy with for whatever it is we're about to do.
I think it's very important to find, because trust, I think we've been very radical in blockchain space to think that because trust has failed, trust is always fireable and therefore should never be used. And I think that was just a plain mistake. And
I will throw it a bone by saying it's useful in some scenarios. Like, I'm really glad that I love the fact that Bitcoin's in the world. I like the fact that it's provable, it works, it's a different economic system, and I wouldn't change anything about it. But that's not the only way that we can approach decentralization.
100%. David, we're nearing the end of this conversation and I'm about to get very sad. Do you have any closing thoughts, remarks, anything you want to share, news about Playmint to yourself?
I think I would encourage, I'd make the point that I think that we've lost our way a little bit in crypto, that we got distracted by meme coins, and I haven't, but as a category, I don't think we should be happy with where we've got to. I think that building games for people to speculate on, okay, it's a use case and it has an audience, but this was something that was supposed to be bigger than that. I would encourage people to think whether there's something bigger at play here. And if there is, I'd love people to contact me and say, look at what we're doing, look at why we've chosen the approaches that we have in Playerchains, and ask whether or not we can introduce decentralization rather than crypto to the world of gaming. I think there's a better path, and I hope the Playmint's on it. It feels like we're kindred spirits in that respect, but yeah, anybody that wants to jump on the train, then I'd love to hear from them.
Lovely. David, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been great. Wish you a pleasant day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sylve.